Hey, it's Josh coming at you with some real biological intelligence, no AI here, to talk about a book called The Heroes, written by Joe Abercrombie, who also wrote my very favorite fantasy books of all time, the original First Law trilogy, although this book is one of the standalone books that falls chronologically between what I believe are the two First Law trilogies. There's the original trilogy, then there's, I believe, 3 standalone books, and then there's another trilogy. Anyways, this is the second standalone book. I talked about Abercrombie's original First Law trilogy and why I loved it so much in an hour-long review that I had posted quite some time back. I also talked about the first standalone book, Best Served Cold, in another hour-long review that I did. I don't understand why anybody watches my videos, and I am curious to know if anybody ever literally watches an hour-long video from start to finish. I'd be shocked if that was the case. But anyways, I appreciate you being here for this one. This book is a little bit unique in comparison to those other books I just mentioned, in that the plot of the book only takes place over a period of 3 days, although there is a bit of an epilogue at the end of the book that talks about a little bit of events sometime after the events of the book. But essentially, from a plot perspective, we're following one single battle between the Northerners and the Union that is taking place over the course of 3 days. So it's a very finely focused book, and for those who complain that Abercrombie's books don't really have plots, I guess you could say that this one, it definitely has a very focused plot in the fact that it focuses just on this one battle over 3 days. Of course, the writing is outstanding. Abercrombie is a master of his craft as far as I'm concerned. He does write, in my mind, the best battle scenes in fantasy, and I guess that works out well considering the entire book is kind of one big battle scene to a certain extent. And there are just constant moments of brilliance. Like, there's one chapter in here called The Casualties that is so brilliantly written. Essentially, the way it's structured is it starts from the point of view of a soldier in the midst of this battle. It follows that soldier until that soldier is killed, and then it picks up the point of view from the soldier that killed that soldier, and it follows that soldier's point of view for a little while until that soldier is killed, and then it follows the point of view of the soldier that killed him, and so on and so forth, down this row of participants in this battle, one at a time as they're killed in war. And it's really brilliantly done. It is, of course, grimdark fantasy, so it's very violent, very dark, and yet Abercrombie really has this great sense of humor woven through this very dark and bleak setting, which really helps to make an enjoyable reading experience despite the violence and the nasty things that are going on. And just to give one example of a bit of humor here, we have actually a character that was a focus of some of the previous stories in the First Law worlds, a character named Shivers, who had lost an eye in one of the previous books. And on that note, I will say, although it is a standalone work, it does reference a lot of characters from the previous books in the series. Like I said, the trilogy plus the other standalone book. There are characters present in the background that were more main characters in the previous works, and it does mention events that happened in those books. And so the problem is with my goldfish memory, which is so terrible and somewhat frightening given my family history of Alzheimer's. But this is the reason that when I read an actual series, I read the books back to back to back typically without reading anything in between, so that I don't forget. I mean, I already have a hard time keeping track of a ton of characters in a big series as it is, but I like to read things back to back so that I don't forget things. The problem with spacing out the standalone books is I tend to forget what events they're referring to in the past. It's not a huge deal. It doesn't really take away from the story, but I do wish I had a better memory for those kind of details. But anyways, I was going to talk about this character, Shivers, who had lost an eye. And there's another character named Craw who is speaking with Shivers, and he asks Shivers, "You get scared, Shivers?" A pause, that eye of his glinting as the sun peeped through the branches, because he has this metal eye to replace the one he lost. "Used to. All the time." "What changed?" "Got my eye burned out on my head." So much for calming small talk. "Reckon that could change your outlook." "It halves it." Having one eye, I guess, does cut your outlook in half, doesn't it? So it's just that type of kind of dark humor that really helps to elevate these books even more, and the way they're written. Another reason I love Abercrombie's writing is he does characters so well. Each character is just such a unique individual. It's not like some other fantasy books I've read where it's a little hard to distinguish one character from the next in terms of they're all, you know, more or less the same with similar motivations. But in Abercrombie's books, they are definitely very unique and interesting characters. We follow several point of views throughout the course of the book. I would say there's kind of one main point of view on each side of the conflict. There is this fellow named Kerndon Craw of the Northerners, and another guy named Bremer Dan Gorst on the Union side, who are two of the main characters we follow, although there are several other main players in the story, including a couple of strong female characters, which I do appreciate. Abercrombie is not one of these fantasy authors that forgets that women exist in the world. He does include them in strong and important roles, so that's pretty cool. But of those two characters, I really quite like Kerndon Craw, even though he has some similarities with one of Abercrombie's other standout characters from the original trilogy called Sandan Glokta. They both have these old injuries and aches and problems with walking and complaining in their old age with dealing with their injuries and stuff like that. So, you know, I feel like Kerndon Craw is as cool a character as he is, does borrow a fair bit from Sandan Glokta. As far as Bremer Dan Gorst goes, I found him to be a quite annoying character. I didn't love being in his shoes, so you know, that's a bit of a minor hit against the book. I didn't particularly love that character, but still, he was very much, you know, like I said, a very unique and standout character, despite the fact that I might not have enjoyed him all that much. Speaking of things I didn't like as much, the book does have the usual minor niggles that I've had in the past. We see multiple examples of characters with swords just slicing through armor like butter, and especially slicing through chainmail, which is just not a thing that would ever happen historically. Of course, these are fantasy books, so I guess you have a little more leeway of what you want to do in a fantasy book as opposed to a historical fiction work. But yeah, I don't like how completely ineffective armor was made to seem. One weird thing that Abercrombie likes to do, and I talked about it in my review of Best Served Cold, is that for some reason he likes to describe blood coming out of people as being black. For example, there's this battle scene. Gorst smashed him in the head with his shield and snapped his helmet back, blood squirting from his severed arm in thick black drops. And not to belabor the point again, but as a paramedic who has experience with a great deal of blood in all kinds, from fountaining arterial bleeds to oozing venous bleeds, blood, especially arterial blood, is very bright red. I don't know why Abercrombie continually insists on describing blood as being black. It's kind of weird. And then I have the usual complaint about characters being able to read so many details just from basic facial expressions. There's this example. He wore an expression somewhat sad, somewhat determined, as if he did not like what was coming, but could see no way to avoid it, and now was fixed on seeing it through, whatever it cost him. That is what's read from a facial expression. Seems kind of strange, but those are minor niggles. I'll get to the stuff that I did like quite a bit. Another thing that I think Abercrombie does better than any other author I've read is talk about war in its most real sense. I think a lot of fantasy tends to glorify armed conflict and victorious warriors and all that stuff, but Abercrombie does the exact opposite, and it presents it in a much more real way, which I think adds to the grimdark label that he gets. And as I get into the details here a bit, I'm first going to rant about a bit of a pet peeve of mine, and I'll just read you this little passage and talk about that for a second. We have one of the female characters named Finri riding through an army camp on horseback, and she overhears this conversation between two soldiers. One says, "Regulations say flour's an acceptable substitute for bread," replied the quartermaster, measuring out a tiny quantity on his scales with frowning precision. "Acceptable to who? What are we going to bake it on?" You can bake it on your fat arse as far as I'm... Oh, begging your pardon, my lady, tugging his forelock as Finri rode past, as though seeing men go hungry for no good reason could cause no offense, but the word arse might overcome her delicate sensibilities. And this brings me to my pet peeve, which is people's ire towards what they consider to be bad language. They can read a book like this that's just chock full of violence and people doing horrible things to other humans, and yet they'll bristle at seeing the word shit or fuck spoken frequently throughout the book, as if that's the thing that is going to cause harm to their children, when the extreme violence is totally acceptable. And, I have always had a saying where I wouldn't say there are no bad words, because I think that words that are derogatory descriptors of groups of people, like racial slurs, are bad words. But what we would consider to be cursing, I'm going to say, is not necessarily bad. If somebody is expressing themselves through saying a word like shit or something, they're expressing an emotion, I don't think there's anything inherently bad about that. But if they're using that same word to denigrate somebody else, if they're saying you are a piece of shit, then I suppose it could be true. If they're a Nazi, then maybe that's just factually correct. But for the most part, that is now taking a word and using it to tear down somebody, and in that sense it becomes a bad word. So, a word like fuck or shit can be said, I think, in harmless ways, and it can be said in ways that are bad, that tear people down, that are unkind to other people. And I like that Joe included this, that the soldiers aren't concerned about the fact that men are being treated horribly and starving, and yet they're concerned that this lady might hear them say the word arse. And it is kind of a funny comparison, I suppose. Now let me show you some examples of why I think Abercrombie does a great job of exposing war for what it really is. Starting with a character, a new recruit in the Northern Army named Letterleden, who had recently joined the army, and after his first taste of it, was starting to rethink the whole situation. So he is thinking to himself, and he's thinking his cousin had warned him not to enlist, had told him wars were upside down places where good men did worse than bad, had told him wars were all about rich men's ambitions and poor men's graves, and there hadn't been two honest fellows to strike a spark of decency in the whole company he had served with, that officers were all arrogance, ignorance, and incompetence, that soldiers were all cowards, braggarts, bullies, or thieves. Letterlegen had supposed his cousin to be exaggerating for effect, but now had to admit that he seemed rather to have understood the case. In another scene, we have two ladies, Finri and Elise, who are talking to each other about war. And Elise sighs and says, "War is terrible, isn't it?" Finri responds, "It blights the landscape, throttles commerce and industry, kills the innocent and rewards the guilty, thrusts honest men into poverty and lines the pockets of profiteers, and in the end produces nothing but corpses, monuments, and tall tales." Finri neglected to mention that it also offered enormous opportunities, however. Sticking with Finri, in this next scene, Finri is staying in an inn that has become part of the battlefield, and so it's been taken over by the leaders and generals and so forth. And Finri, again, is thinking to herself, she wondered what had become of the owners of the inn, wondered what its name was even. She thought she had seen a pole over the gate, but the sign was gone. That's what war does. Strips people and places of their identities and turns them into enemies in a line, positions to be taken, resources to be foraged, anonymous things that can be carelessly crushed and stolen and burned without guilt. War is hell and all that, but full of opportunities. Going back to some new recruits, we have this comparison of the new recruits to the army being compared to sheep that are about to be slaughtered. And so behind a screen of hides, not 2 strides from the flock, a woman was slaughtering the sheep, and 3 more doing the skinning and gutting and hanging the carcasses, all soaked to the armpits in blood and not caring much about it either. 2 lads, probably just reached fighting age, were watching, laughing at how stupid the sheep were, not able to guess what was happening behind those hides. They didn't see that they were in the pen, and behind a screen of songs and stories and young men's dreams, war was waiting, soaked to the armpits and not caring. Going back to that other new recruit, Letterlingen, he's talking to his commanding officer, and they are ordered to do something, and he says to his officer, "This is stupid." Tunney rubbed at his tired eyes with finger and thumb. How often had he had to explain this to a set of recruits? "Look, you think how stupid people are most of the time. Old men drunk, women at a village fair, boys throwing stones at birds. Life, the foolishness and the vanity, the selfishness and the waste, the pettiness, the silliness. You think in a war it must be different, must be better. With death around the corner, men united against hardship, the cunning of the enemy, people must think harder, faster, be better, be heroic. Only it's just the same. In fact, do you know, because of all that pressure and worry and fear, it's worse. There aren't many men who think clearest when the stakes are highest, so people are even stupider in a war than the rest of the time, thinking about how they'll dodge the blame or grab the glory or save their skins rather than about what will actually work. There's no job that forgives stupidity more than soldiering, no job that encourages it more. And speaking of soldiering, we have another conversation between one of these young recruits and the same officer, and the young recruit says, "What should we do?" "Nothing whatsoever, trooper. Unless specifically and precisely instructed otherwise, a good soldier always does nothing." In a narrow triangle between black branches, the sky was starting to show the faintest sickly tinge of light. Tunney winced and closed his eyes. The thing folks at home never realize about war is just how bloody boring it is. And now, before I get to my rating of the book, I'll talk about a few other great points that I found here and there throughout the book. I liked this little comment about leadership, where one officer is dealing with the fact that the enemy is charging them and most of his men are running away, and he's yelling at them, "Cowards!" And it says, "But there was naught Curly could do. A chief can kick one or two boys into line, but when the lot of them just up and run, he's helpless. Being in charge can seem like a thing iron forged, but in the end is just an idea everyone agrees to." By the time he ducked back behind the log, everyone had stopped agreeing, and far as he could tell, it was just him and the stranger with the red hood. And, I mean, I think that's a great point for our society, that the people who rule over us in our societies, the rich, the powerful, the 1%, they really are just the 1%. The 99%, if we were united in our purposes, would have all the power, despite the 1% having all the money and all the current power, because we have just agreed that they will rule us and they will be in charge, and they can apparently get away with whatever they want to get away with, because even though we are the vast majority, agreed to let them do so. So it's just something that I thought was interesting to keep in mind about leadership. A lot of the time what we're told by our leadership is the right thing to do. I would say, from a moral standpoint, is absolutely not the right thing to do. And this next point hints at that a little bit. We have our character Craw talking to another gentleman. The other guy says, "Look after yourself, eh, Craw? Ain't many of us left know the difference between the right thing and the wrong." And Craw says, "What difference?" And well, I think there is a lot of nuance that, you know, between the right thing and the wrong thing, the good thing and the bad thing, even though human brains like to look at things in black and white as being good and evil, and they struggle to deal with gray areas. I think the truth is, again, going back to this whole idea of grimdark really brings out the gray areas in life. And that's one thing I love about the genre, is it's not good versus evil like in the old classic fantasy that I really increasingly dislike because it's so not related to life at all. But there are people who do good things and bad things. There are events and things people do that straddle the line between the two, and yet again, what we know morally, there are certainly things that are evil and there are things that are good. There are choices that actively help and lift people up, and there are choices that actively harm people and tear them down. And so I like this quote as well. One character says, "Anyway, it seems to me a man can do an awful lot of evil in no time at all. Swing of a blade is all it takes. Doing good needs time and all manner of complicated efforts. Most men don't have the patience for it, especially not these days." Isn't that truth? It's often so much harder and more exhausting to do the right thing, isn't it? And then the very final thing here I'll look at is just a good perspective on life in general. We have our character Finri again, who is in a privileged position. Her father is commander of the Union Army, and she's looking at these civilians who have been affected by this huge battle that has taken over their houses, their lands, their towns, and she is thinking to herself, looking at them, Finri felt shamefully secure, revoltingly lucky. It is easy to forget how much you have when your eyes are always fixed on what you have not. It's a good reminder for us and a good perspective to keep. So after all that, what would my rating of the book be? I would say it's not up to the perfect 10 out of 10 that I rated the original First Law trilogy. Like I said, I had some minor niggles. There was one of the main POVs that I didn't love, but I also enjoyed it more than the first standalone book, Best Served Cold. I thought Best Served Cold had, as usual, amazing writing, amazing characters, but I didn't really like the story that was told, the story of revenge in Best Served Cold. So I had rated that an 8 out of 10. This one is going to fall between the two. I'm going to give The Heroes a 9 out of 10. It's still amongst the best fantasy ever. I will continue to read through the other standalone books and probably get into the next trilogy at some point. Probably try not to wait too much time in between again so I don't forget characters and events as much, but we'll see how that works out. I'd love to hear what you've been reading. I am especially interested in hearing what have been hits for you lately, and regardless, I just really appreciate you watching, and I really appreciate my Patreon supporters who just really provide me the support and motivation I need to keep on going with this YouTube stuff. To Mojo Damn, Saver Girl, Adam W, Joanna N, Asmanas Pervect, Abel, thank you so much for your support. Really appreciate you, and I'll catch you on the next one. Cheers. Hey, it's Josh here to talk. About it. And we can continually assist. I will continue to read through the standalone series and other Abercrombie books. The standalone series.